At Thanksgiving dinner, my parents said I was a useless failure and threw me out. Go live in the streets, my father commanded. But they did not know I earned $25 million a year, so I just smiled and left. 3 weeks later, their world began to collapse. The setting was supposed to be perfect. The dining room table was set with heirloom china my mother, Vivian, used only twice a year. The centerpiece was a sprawling cornucopia that looked ripped from a magazine cover. 22 people sat around the table, a sea of cousins, aunts, and uncles, all dressed in varying shades of holiday tweed and wool. But the perfection was just a great disguise, and my parents wore it better than anyone. The air in the room was thick with the scent of sage and roasting turkey, but to me, it always smelled like performance anxiety. I was seated at the far end, tucked beside a folding table extension. As if I were a distant acquaintance rather than their 32-year-old daughter, Sadie. My father, Harold, cleared his throat, signaling the customary toast. He usually spoke about the blessings of family, but this year, his eyes, cold and focused, trapped mine. He did not lower his voice or soften the blow for the audience. Sadie, he started, his voice resonating through the sudden silence. We have much to be thankful for, but clarity must come first. Your mother and I have spent years trying to understand your path, your internet hobbies, your refusal to take a proper corporate job. He paused just long enough for the weight of every eye at the table to settle on me. It is time to face the truth. You are a drain. You are a failure, Sadie, and frankly, you are useless to this family. The word, useless, hung in the air, heavy and solid. My throat constricted, not in sudden tears, but in a familiar tightening that had been rehearsed since childhood. Crystal, my younger sister and the golden child, hid a satisfied smirk behind her linen napkin. She was the one they spoke of with pride, the one whose boutique, recently renovated, was the centerpiece of their current obsession. My mother did not blink. Her composure was flawless. A chilling confirmation that this had been rehearsed between them. My father continued, his voice rising slightly in volume, as if addressing a defiant employee. We can no longer allow you to cling to the periphery of our success. The time for pretense is over. You embarrass us. Get up. I waited. Get up, Sadie, and go, he instructed, pointing toward the front door without hesitation. You want to live by your own strange rules. Then go live by them. Go live in the streets. For all I care. Just get out of this house. The silence that followed was a physical entity, pressing the oxygen from the room. Every relative looked away, finding sudden, intense interest in their mashed potatoes or the rim of a water glass. No one spoke for me. No one challenged him. The silence was their compliance. My chair felt a mile away from anyone who had ever claimed to love me. I did not fight. I did not scream back the truth of my life. The successful company I ran in Seattle, the automated systems that generated my enormous income, the fact that I had not needed their approval or their resources for years. I had survived worse verbal attacks. What broke me this time was the ease with which they dismissed me publicly, the clean, public cut that showed zero regret. Instead, I stood slowly. I smoothed my simple, unpretentious woolen coat, a gesture of quiet dignity that felt alien in that room of exaggerated drama. My movements were steady, controlled. I walked past the table, past my sister's veiled gaze, past my mother's vacant stare, and toward the door. I carried their judgment on my back like a weight I had finally stopped pretending was not there. They had no idea I was the owner of a major Seattle-based technology firm, a person with an annual income of $25 million. They had no idea I could buy and sell this house 3 times over without noticing the cost. Their version of me, the struggling hobbyist, was so necessary to their self-concept that they refused to see the reality. I opened the front door and stepped out. The air outside was November cold, hitting my face with a welcome, shocking blast. The immediate release, the sensation of the cold air, was a moment of profound clarity. Stepping onto the pavement, I realized the cold air felt like freedom. The line had been drawn, not by me, but by them. For years, I had held onto a hope, a tiny, fragile belief that if I was successful enough, quiet enough, and unobtrusive enough, they might one day accept me. That hope shattered into a million pieces the moment my father pointed at the street. My parents and sister were sitting inside, confident that they had solved their little problem, that the failure had been banished, leaving their curated, perfect world intact. They were so busy defining my life that they had failed to notice the foundational cracks in their own. I reached for my phone, calling my ride to the airport. In 3 weeks, everything they thought they controlled would collapse in front of them, and I would be the one holding the hammer. That Thanksgiving night, the pain was still sharp, but the realization of my own immense, unacknowledged power was cold and absolute. I was done trying to earn a place in a family that never wanted me whole. I was ready to protect myself, no matter the cost. The days immediately following Thanksgiving felt strangely hollow, as if someone had deliberately lowered the volume on the world around me. The cold air of Seattle had been a clean shock, a welcome slap of reality that contrasted sharply with the suffocating performance of Portland. But even 3 days later, the echoes of my father's command, "Go live in the streets," still scraped at the sealed, over wounds of childhood. I went through my corporate routine with the sharp focus that had defined my success, but my mind kept drifting back to that dining room table. I reviewed product specs, led strategy calls with my technical leads, and handled budgets that dwarfed the entirety of my parents' net worth. Yet, through every calculated decision and every polished presentation, I saw my mother's unflinching gaze and the smug satisfaction on my sister Crystal's face. I was performing, even in my own life, trying to prove to the phantom audience of my family that I was whole. The $25 million annual income, the penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the water, the quiet confidence of my attorney. None of it could erase the humiliation delivered so cleanly and publicly. How could people who knew so little about my real life feel so confident in defining it as failure? I had spent years guarding my heart and hiding my success, believing that silence was the safest path. Now, I realized my silence had only provided them with the perfect empty canvas on which to paint their preferred narrative. The aftershock of humiliation rarely ends when the moment passes, it has a delayed, painful arrival. Mine landed 3 days after I returned to my fortress in the sky. I was standing in my kitchen, waiting for the sleek, stainless steel kettle to boil for my morning herbal tea, when my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Mason, my cousin, the high school teacher in Portland. Mason was the only person in that family who had ever treated me like a person instead of a problem. The message was short. Sadie, I need to tell you something. Your mom's been talking. My stomach tightened instantly. I knew what talking meant in the Hartman family. Rewriting history. I typed back, talking how? The reply came a minute later. Measured and reluctant. She told everyone at church and the book club that you're essentially homeless in Seattle. Said your internet hobbies finally fell apart, and you're couch surfing, bouncing between friends until you figure things out. I set the phone down gently on the quartz countertop. The room, usually a sanctuary of calm, seemed to spin for a second. Homeless, couch surfing, failed at life. They did not just throw me out. They actively fabricated a story that reinforced their judgment. A story that fit perfectly with the failure narrative my father had publicly outlined. They did it with the same confident authority they used when calling Crystal a genius for simply breathing. I finally texted back. The words laced with a bitterness I rarely allowed myself to feel. I have a 3-bedroom penthouse. I own the building my company occupies. Mason's reply was the one that cut deeper than the lie itself, striking the core of my internal conflict. I know. They do not want to know. They did not want to know. Knowing the truth. Knowing that everything they had mocked, minimized, and dismissed had blossomed into a financial success they could not control, would force them to confront the smallness of their own judgment. They needed me to be a failure to justify their treatment of me, to justify the golden glow they cast on Crystal. The lie was not for the community, it was for them. I stood there, staring out at the expansive Seattle skyline, the mist hovering low over the water, and let the sting of their deliberate ignorance settle. My emotional guardedness felt foolish now. It had only served to protect them from the truth, while they casually executed a campaign of character assassination against me. The sting, however, was about to be replaced by a deeper, colder realization. 2 days after Mason's message, the aftershock turned into a fault line. An email slid into my inbox from a law office based in Portland. The subject line was chillingly formal. Confirmation required for your guarantor status. Guarantor for what? I opened the message. For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. The attached records referenced a massive renovation loan, around $400,000, taken out 2 years earlier. According to the file, I, Sadie Hartman, was listed as the guarantor. I had never signed anything for them. I would not have. But the file included a clean scan of my signature. One glance, and every nerve in my body went cold. They had forged my name on a substantial loan. A loan partially funneled directly into Crystal's boutique. The very boutique she bragged about like it was her destiny. The humiliation at Thanksgiving suddenly made cruel, pragmatic sense. They needed me small, powerless, easier to control, easier to frame as unstable if the loan ever collapsed. They needed the useless failure they had defined. I stood in the quiet of my kitchen, the city lights flickering against the glass, and let the truth settle like ice in my veins. They had not just thrown me out, they had stolen from me. And the most terrifying part of all was their absolute, inherent belief that they had the right to do it. That night, something inside me finally stopped aching and started hardening. The pain was over. The strategy had begun. The coldness that settled in my veins after discovering the forged loan was more profound than any anger. It was a chemical reaction. A transformation of soft feeling into hard, protective clarity. For the first time in my life, I was not trying to understand my parents. I was not trying to excuse them. I was simply done. But being done did not mean walking away and letting them drag my reputation and my financial stability down with them. Being done meant drawing a line they could never step over again. The email confirming my purported guarantor status lay open on my massive desktop screen. A stark document detailing their betrayal. The loan was for $400,000, secured by a forgery that, if left unattended, could expose me to significant liability. They had not just wounded me emotionally, they had created a financial weapon and pointed it directly at my life. I spent the next morning methodically combing through every attachment and reference the Portland law firm had sent. Payment schedules, building permits, records tied to the high-end renovation of Crystal's boutique. Every single digital trail led back to the same chilling truth. Large sums of money had been moved without transparency, and the loan secured with my falsified signature was already slipping dangerously close to default. If that loan defaulted, the lender would initiate recovery procedures, seizing collateral, forcing a sale, and absolutely dragging every listed guarantor through litigation. If my name stayed on that paperwork, I would be professionally and personally exposed to the consequences of their deliberate crime. I printed every single page of the documentation. The physical stack of paper felt heavy in my hand, a testament to the weight of their calculated malice. Then, I forwarded everything to my corporate attorney, Grant West, in Seattle. Grant called within 2 minutes. He rarely displayed surprise, but the sharpness in his voice was unmistakable. "Sadie," he said, "this is not sloppy. This is deliberate, coordinated fraud. It is a crime." "I know," I replied, my voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside. The initial shock had been replaced by a quiet, focused determination. "Are you sure you are ready to pursue this?" he asked, his professional concern overriding his usual detached demeanor. "Once we open this door, once we introduce the legal system into their lives, it will not close quietly. The implications for your family, your parents, your sister, are severe." "That is the point, Grant," I confirmed. "They used my identity to fund a business venture and secure their home improvements, and then publicly labeled me a useless failure to ensure I would be too powerless to fight back when the fraud came to light. This is not about revenge. This is about protection and accountability." We began the process immediately. Grant initiated verification of handwriting inconsistencies, tracking the movement of the $400,000, and documenting every piece of financial misrepresentation they had orchestrated. The deeper his team looked, the clearer one devastating pattern became. My family, the image of suburban perfection, had built their recent life upgrades. The stunning kitchen, Crystal's boutique, the expensive cars, on borrowed, not earned, money. And the one dependable constant in their entire, risky structure was my name, used as their safety net. That realization did not hurt in the usual way. The emotional pain had been excised on Thanksgiving night. What hurt was how naturally they must have believed I would never fight back. Their confidence in my failure was so absolute that they thought they could use me, discard me, and I would simply disappear. They had underestimated the cold, fierce resourcefulness that had earned me a $25 million annual income. My emotional guardedness had trained me for this. It had taught me to observe, analyze, and act without attachment. Now, that same guardedness was serving as my shield. For the first time, my success was not a secret I kept out of fear of rejection, but a weapon I wielded for self-preservation. This was the moment the shadow of their judgment finally retreated, replaced by the steady, unyielding light of my own power. I was not breaking. I was sharpening. The investigative phase, while emotionally draining, was fundamentally necessary. Every day, Grant West's legal team unearthed more financial threads, detailing the extent of the reliance my family had placed on the $400,000 renovation loan. It became clear that the entire facade of perfection, the luxury cars, the endless renovations, the funding for Crystal's boutique, was a house of cards, its only structural support being the forged signature of the daughter they had publicly deemed a failure. I didn't need to be involved in the minutiae, but I chose to be. I reviewed the spreadsheets, the payment gaps, and the records of inconsistent transfers. It was a cold, necessary immersion into their calculated deceit. This was not the struggle for acceptance I had waged my whole life. This was an executive decision to protect my sovereignty. My $25 million annual income gave me power, but the forgery gave me purpose. 3 days into the full review, Grant called me again, his tone shifting from investigative concern to strategic opportunity. "Sadie," he started, "the loan is in a precarious position. The current holder is getting increasingly anxious about the default risk. They have begun signaling to the market that they might consider transferring control of the debt if a qualified, clean buyer steps in to absorb the risk." I felt a sudden rush of adrenaline, not panic, but recognition. This was the door, finally swinging open. "And I am qualified," I stated, a fact, not a question. "You are more than qualified," Grant confirmed dryly. "Given your corporate profile, your liquid assets, and your direct tie, albeit a fraudulent one, to the collateral, you would be first in line. If you want the option to take over the loan, to become the primary creditor, I can initiate the process immediately." I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window in my penthouse, looking out at the vast, gray Seattle skyline. The clouds were rolling low over the Puget Sound, a perfect reflection of the cold certainty settling into my chest. To acquire the debt meant acquiring the leverage. It meant that instead of fighting against an external lender, I would control the entire timeline and terms of the unraveling. It was the ultimate reversal of fortune. They had created the crisis using my name, and I would now resolve it using my resources. "Do it, Grant," I said, the words clean and final. "Acquire the debt. Position us to take over the moment it triggers full default." That decision felt like a fuse being lit. It was a complete abandonment of the emotional burden I had carried since childhood. I was no longer Sadie, the inconvenience, the shadow. I was Sadie, the acquiring party. Throughout this entire high-stakes process, The silence from Portland was absolute. No one called to apologize for the Thanksgiving attack. No one called to explain the forgery. No one called to even lie about the slander my mother had spread. It was a silence louder than any shouting, a confirmation of their profound belief in their own blamelessness. They simply expected the world to rearrange itself to accommodate their choices. What hurt, truly, was not their crime, but the utter absence of any hesitation or regret about committing it. They did not even consider the possibility that I would fight back. But now I was fighting, not with shouting or tears, but with corporate law and $25 million in annual income. And I knew that when the moment came, my legal power would be far more devastating than any emotional outburst. I was ready to claim the accountability they had never offered. The decision to acquire the debt lit the fuse on a high-stakes, 2-week corporate maneuver executed with surgical precision. My attorney, Grant West, and his team moved quietly, leveraging my financial profile to prepare for the moment the loan would tip into full default. The irony was not lost on me. The money my parents despised, the success they refused to acknowledge, was now the only thing standing between me and the financial disaster they had created. This phase was defined by secrecy and strategy. We were not merely paying off the loan, we were positioning ourselves to legally seize control of the financial instrument itself. The goal was to secure leverage over the property and the entirety of the financial choices tied to it. It was a hostile takeover, not of a company, but of a manufactured crisis. I tracked the loan's health religiously. Every late payment, every missed deadline, pushed the situation further toward the precipice. I pored over the legal details with a dispassionate focus that served as a psychological shield. I had to remain the professional CEO, detached and analytical, refusing to let the personal betrayal contaminate the strategic objective. Nothing about this move was fundamentally vindictive. It was, purely and simply, protection. My name, my reputation, and my work were on the line because of their calculated fraud. If they pulled me into a mess they created, I would ensure that I had total control over how that mess unraveled. This clarity was my strength. It prevented the rage from obscuring the objective. And still, throughout the entire process, not a single person from my family called. There was no apology, no explanation, not even a weak attempt to reach out and mitigate the damage. The silence was almost poetic. They were utterly unaware that while they waited for the anonymous lender to come after them, I was quietly building the very mechanism that would fundamentally change everything in their lives. They had thrown me out, and I had simply bought the ground they stood on. I recalled my sister Crystal's arrogant, off-hand comments about how well her boutique was doing, how her life was a testament to following the right path. That path, I now knew, was paved with my forged signature and $400,000 of debt. She was the golden child, living a gilded life, built on a lie. I spent hours alone in my penthouse, looking out at the glittering lights of Seattle, contemplating the immense chasm between their reality and mine. My life was defined by building systems that worked, by accountability, and by earned success. Theirs was defined by image, entitlement, and fraud. By the time the third week after Thanksgiving arrived, I was no longer emotionally guarded, I was simply settled. Grant called late Tuesday afternoon. "It is done, Sadie. The default has triggered. We have stepped in. You are now the creditor, first in line, and fully in control of the debt instrument." I closed my laptop slowly. The familiar sound clicking like a final, closing lock. That same cold clarity I felt the night my father threw me out returned. It had been 3 weeks since I had been told to go live in the streets. Now, I controlled their biggest liability, their home, and the future of their entire lifestyle. The moment of reckoning was finally at hand. The process was officially underway. Grant's voice, confirming the debt acquisition, had provided the final, settling piece of a 3-week strategy. "You now control the debt and effectively everything tied to it," he had said. "Everything: the home in Portland, the collateral securing the loan, and the entire fragile foundation of the life my parents and sister, Crystal, had constructed. The power was mine, not for triumph, but for defense." We spent the next 4 days meticulously preparing the documents that would deliver the consequences. There was no need for cruelty or theatrics. The facts themselves were devastating enough. We drafted clear legal notices, outlined 2 very simple, very fair options, and structured the repayment terms. Option 1, sell the property within a defined period and fully resolve the debt. Option 2, if they chose not to sell, I would assume ownership of the property, and they could remain as tenants under a strict, structured rental contract. It was consequence, delivered with the cold, legal efficiency they never imagined I possessed. I was stepping out of a late afternoon strategy meeting with my own team. Unrelated to the loan, thankfully, when Grant's number flashed across my screen. I answered, expecting a final procedural update. "I think you need to know about the atmosphere in Portland, Sadie," Grant said, his voice measured. "The news of the default is circulating. Your family is panicking. They are consulting lawyers, trying to negotiate terms with the original lender, thinking they can buy time. They have absolutely no idea it's you." I felt a sudden, sharp clarity. Their panic was not fear of accountability. It was fear of losing the image they had spent years cultivating. Then, the unexpected element arrived: a call from Mason. I hadn't spoken to him since he delivered the news about my mother's slander. I hesitated, then answered. "Sadie," Mason said, his voice low and urgent, strained with tension. "I had to call. Crystal is completely panicking. Your parents are convinced the bank is coming to seize everything. They are running on 0 sleep. They are telling people this is just a misunderstanding. But they are terrified." He paused. A breath that sounded ragged with his own internal conflict. "I do not think they will handle it well when the legal notice finally hits their door." I almost laughed, a dry, humorless sound. Handle it well. They had forged my signature, humiliated me in front of every relative, and slandered me across their entire social circle. And they expected the universe to protect them from the fallout they had created. But Mason's voice cracked, a small, unexpected sound that found a tiny opening in my emotional armor. He had always been good, always kind. And I realized I did not want him blindsided by the explosion I was about to set off. I needed him to understand this was not spite, but surgery. I did not want their panic. I wanted their understanding, not of my success, but of the absolute, unforgivable nature of the boundary they had broken. "Mason," I said. I need you to tell them to meet me. Friday dinner. Bellevue House. Tell them I have arranged a private negotiation, meeting with the lender's representative. You arranged it? Mason sounded utterly confused. Yes. Tell them it is the only way to get ahead of the process. Tell them to bring their lawyers, their documents, and their best manners. Tell them to bring Crystal. Mason exhaled sharply. They will think the lender wants to negotiate a new payment plan. Good, I said. Let them walk in believing that. It was a cold, calculated staging. I knew a legal document delivered by a process server would lead to outrage and avoidance, a face-to-face confrontation, orchestrated under false pretenses of diplomacy, would force them to sit and absorb the truth in a single, unadulterated shock. I had given them every chance to apologize, to confess, to reach out, and they had offered only silence and ongoing deceit. Now, the stage was set for accountability, on my terms, in a private room far from their curated world. I felt the weight of years of silent hurt concentrating itself into a single, unyielding moment of power. The line between protection and consequence was about to vanish. Friday came, cold and quiet, the perfect stage for consequence. The mist from the Puget Sound had rolled into Seattle, draping the city in a muted, ethereal blanket that clung to the windows of the Bellevue House restaurant. I arrived early. Walking into the private dining room with Grant West, my attorney, at my side. The table was set for 5. With candlelight and an understated elegance that suited my preference for clarity over ostentation. There were no flowers, just crisp white linens, and a few discreet folders containing the documentation. This was not a dinner. It was a courtroom staged for maximum impact. I felt a profound stillness, the emotional core of my guarded self completely steady. When the door opened, the air in the room instantly thickened. My mother, Vivian, walked in first. Her hair was immaculate, her makeup flawless. But her expression was tight, pulled into a mask of strained composure. She was fighting to maintain the illusion of control, even now. My father, Harold, followed behind her, his jaw locked in a posture of brittle defiance. They looked smaller than they had 3 weeks ago, worn down by days of panic over the looming default. Crystal trailed last. Her eyes were red, rimmed. But she carried herself with an air of theatrical victimhood, as if she were the one being wronged. Mason was the final one to enter. His gaze darting quickly to mine, a silent plea for understanding in his eyes. He sat down quickly, avoiding my parents' increasingly tense silence. My parents did not greet me. They simply took their seats, their attention fixed on Grant, whom they mistakenly assumed was the lender's representative. Sadie. My mother said carefully, managing a tight, artificial smile. We appreciate you helping arrange this meeting with the lender. We are confident this is all a misunderstanding that can be quickly resolved. Grant West exchanged a swift, silent glance with me, his expression perfectly neutral. He leaned forward, resting his hands and a small stack of documents on the table. Mrs. Hartman, he said, his voice measured and professional. There is no misunderstanding, and I am not the lender's attorney. My father frowned, the first crack showing in his facade of composure. Then why are you here? Because. Grant answered, sliding the first folder. The one containing the debt acquisition documents. forward across the table. My client, Miss Sadie Hartman, is the acquiring party. She now controls the debt. The silence that descended was thick and suffocating. It was absolute. Crystal's sharp intake of breath was the first sound to shatter the quiet. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with unmasked horror. My father's face drained of color entirely, transforming his features from defiant arrogance into a raw, blank canvas of shock. I did not savor the moment. I simply watched the truth land, heavy and final. The realization of their ultimate failure, crashing around them. My father was the first to recover enough voice to speak, and even then, it was a raspy whisper of accusation. You bought our loan. Why would you do that? Because, I said softly, my voice holding an unnerving level of calm. I met his eye, the same intense way he had met mine on Thanksgiving. You put my name on it. My mother shook her head rapidly, grasping for the old excuses. We thought you would understand. Crystal needed help. Your father meant well. Forging my signature on a $400,000 loan is not meaning well. I countered, my voice still quiet. Calling me a failure at Thanksgiving is not help. Telling people I am homeless in Seattle is not concern. It was a calculated, deliberate act of theft and slander. Crystal finally snapped, her composure shattering into desperate fury. Why couldn't you just let it go? You have money! $25 million a year, Mason said. We told him. You do not need this debt. I looked at my sister. The golden child's entitlement was now completely exposed. You are right. I do not need this. What I need is my name not tied to a sinking loan that you all pretended did not exist. I need accountability for the crime you committed against me. Grant slid the next document across the table. These are the terms, he stated, cutting through the rising emotional chaos. You have two options. 1. You can sell the property immediately and fully resolve the debt with the proceeds. 2. If you choose not to sell, Miss Hartman will assume ownership, and you may remain in the home as tenants under a structured rental contract. Beginning immediately. My father leaned forward, his dignity completely gone. We have to rent our own home, he whispered, the sheer impossibility of the situation hitting him. It is not your home, I corrected, the words simple and devastating. Not anymore. My mother began to weep quietly, broken, shallow sobs, not of guilt for what they had done, but of fear for the loss of the curated life she had spent decades maintaining. We are your family, she choked out. How can you do this to us? I leaned forward, closing the distance between us, my voice steady, final. You taught me exactly how. The night you threw me out, you told me I was useless, and to go live in the streets. You said I had nothing. But the truth is, you never knew me at all. I let the statement hang in the silence before continuing. I am not here to punish you. I am here to separate myself permanently from choices that were never mine. I watched Mason rise, his eyes holding a mixture of pain for his family and relief for me. I gave him a slight, private nod of thanks. The only genuine connection made that night. He hugged me quickly, the first physical gesture of genuine warmth I had received from a relative in years, and left. Grant concluded the meeting. You have exactly 7 days to decide which option you will pursue. The moment was over. The climax of years of dismissal was complete, not with shouting, but with the quiet delivery of legal consequences. They left the room looking smaller, defeated, unable to absorb the magnitude of the reversal. Crystal paused at the doorway. Her glossy eyes filled with disbelief. "You could have helped me," she whispered again, a final plea for the enabling they had always expected. "I did," I said, meeting her gaze steadily. "Just not the way you wanted." When the door closed behind them, I let out a breath I had been holding for years. Not from anger, but from release. The silence was finally mine. I walked out of the Bellevue house and into the soft, persistent Seattle rain. It was not a storm, it was a gentle tapping against the pavement, a cleansing sound. I walked slowly, deliberately, not rushing to my waiting car. The weight, that familiar, crushing weight of their expectations, and their constant, critical judgment, finally slipped off my shoulders. It was a physical sensation of lightness, the release of a decades-long burden. 3 weeks earlier, they had told me to go live in the streets, dismissing my $25 million annual income as irrelevant and my existence as a problem. Tonight, they walked out of a building they no longer owned, having been forced to confront the wreckage of their own deceit. The distance between us, both physical and emotional, suddenly felt like true freedom. The week that followed the meeting was marked by a silence far louder than any outburst could have been. There were no frantic phone calls, no desperate pleas, no sudden changes of heart promising reconciliation. Grant forwarded updates as they came in short. Clinical messages noting their hesitation, their consultations with new lawyers, and their growing, painful realization that there was no loophole big enough to crawl through. They had been given a choice that was both legally fair and emotionally definitive. It was not a vengeful option, merely the consequence of their calculated actions. If they chose to rent, I would be their landlord, an untenable position. If they chose to sell, they would liquidate the debt entirely and walk away clean. On the 7th day, just hours before the deadline, the decision arrived. They chose to sell. It was the smartest, cleanest exit. The sale of the property, now under immense pressure, cleared the $400,000 renovation debt in full, released my name from every toxic financial tie, and left them with just enough capital to downsize into a much smaller place across town. No one was ruined. No one was left destitute or desperate. They were simply forced to live within the boundaries of the financial reality they had ignored for years, without the benefit of my stolen leverage. The cascade of consequences continued. Crystal's boutique, the jewel they had funded with my forged signature, did not survive the transition. Without the steady, unauthorized stream of borrowed money, and without the prestige of the old family home, the business folded within a month. She posted a vague, self-pitying message online about new beginnings and unforeseen challenges, never once mentioning the $400,000, the fraud, or the true reason for the collapse. My parents, Harold and Vivian, retreated from the prominent social circles they once dominated. Their curated image, the picture, perfect family with the successful children and the stunning home, was quietly replaced by something humbler, less visible. They traded public performance for private shame. And me, I did not feel victorious. Triumph felt too petty, too loud. I felt steady, grounded, and whole. The entire experience had been a caustic yet cleansing fire, burning away the need for their approval. I went back to my work, my actual, $25 million life in Seattle, a life built entirely on my own validation. For the first time, my success was not something I carried in silence or used as proof of my worth. It was simply my reality, unbothered by whether my parents acknowledged it or not. The emotional guardedness that had defined my life dissolved, replaced by a genuine, self-assured peace. I realized that my fear of rejection had been the only thing keeping me tied to their chaos. Once I prioritized myself, my life stabilized instantly. Mason and I speak occasionally. He is the only connection I kept, a testament to the fact that not all family ties are toxic. He told me the sales process had been humbling for my parents, who had to dismantle the perfection piece by piece. They never mentioned my name to him, or the fact that I was the creditor. They simply accepted the new reality. I haven't spoken to my mother, father, or sister since that dinner. And maybe that is the clearest sign of healing, a silence that does not ache anymore. I built a life that is not shaped by their expectations, their judgments, or their rewritten stories. A life where my worth is not up for debate. My journey from the humiliated daughter, thrown into the metaphorical street, to the woman who owned the ground they stood on was complete. Sometimes protecting yourself is not loud, dramatic retaliation. Sometimes it is choosing peace so decisively, so professionally, that nothing chaotic can ever follow you home again. If any part of this felt familiar, if you have ever had to walk away to save yourself, I hope my story reminds you that it is allowed. This self-sovereignty is the truest freedom there is.